Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Joshua Schimel from University of California, Santa Barbara. Josh received his PhD from University of California, Berkeley. Then he moved to University of Alaska, Fairbanks, to be assistant professor there, and then came back to California as an associate professor and then a full professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. It's a pleasure for me to be here and introduce Josh because we are long-term collaborators. So it's also a personal pleasure for me. So if we look at Josh's statistics, they are staggering. So I'm not going to talk about the hundreds of papers that he published as author or main author or co-author and the literally millions of dollars of research funding he gathered. But just tell you something a little bit beyond these numbers. So Josh is a very dedicated scientist, and he is spending a lot of time to improve the scientific community through editorial work. He is now, has been for a few years, editor-in-chief in soil biology and biochemistry, one of the most important journals in soil science, and he has been editor in many other journals. And he also reviews papers, and quite strange today, he actually signs his reviews. And that's the way... Occasionally, okay. But anyway, this was how we got in touch. He reviewed one of my early papers. And in that review, there were so many ideas that we actually had to write another paper, and we did it together. So that's how this collaboration started.
He did it, and I saw my name on it once he sent me the draft. And I've been grateful ever since.
So recently, apart from Josh's work on microbial ecology and soils, Josh has been interested in communicating science, and that's what today's presentation is about.
Yeah, if you want the science talk, come up to Uppsala tomorrow. So yeah, this is something that has become something of a passion of mine, in part because when I became a new assistant professor and realized I knew how to do research, but all of a sudden my job wasn't just to generate data, it was actually to publish papers and get proposals written. And I didn't know how to do that. And so I've been thinking about that for a long time, and it led by accident to writing a book. But writing is a hard thing, and it's always nice to start with Calvin and Hobbes. You know, oh, I realize the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report? The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transformation or gender modes. Academia, here I come. Unfortunately, a lot of us do write this way. The reason it's a good joke is because it's not so much of a joke. And really part of the question I always have is, why is what we do hard to read? You know, no, if you make the paper too easy to read, everyone will know how you got the results. Well, of course, we think we want people to know how we got the results. And it is a fundamental thing that what we do is hard. Generating good data, asking good questions is hard, and communicating those is equally hard, maybe more so. I mean, people have been asking questions about nature since Homo sapiens actually first evolved. We've only been writing for about, 4,000 years. It's a very new thing in human evolution. And it's hard in part because we are dealing with complex thoughts about new things and new ideas. And we have new ideas to discuss. And one example of that is this. This was really a buzz a couple of years ago, this idea of trying to explain things using only the simplest words in the English language, the 1,000 simplest words. And so they talked about the Upgoer 5 challenge. You know what the Upgoer 5 was? That. But would you have ever have guessed? I mean, I think this is sort of this great piece of fiction, because basically to describe complex things using simple words, you have to do it the way the Germans do, just smash words together and create new compound terms like upgoer, which could be a rocket, which goes up one hopes, or it could be an escalator, could be a rock climber. I wouldn't know which of those just from the words until you tell me. Of course, it could also then become a downgoer. So we suffer from hard things to do, and we also suffer when we're trying to communicate from what's been called the curse of knowledge. I know what I know, what I'm trying to communicate is obvious to me. It may not be obvious to you. And so we often talk from our own perspectives and end up kind of going like that past each other, because I may use a word in different ways than you perceive it, or you just don't have any idea what that word means. You know, what we say to dogs, blah, 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 what dogs hear, blah, blah, ginger, blah, blah, ginger. You know. That's not fair. My golden retriever knows a lot more words. She knows go and treat and lots of good verbs too. But again, what we say and what someone hears can be different. So a fundamental principle in thinking about communication isn't what we give, it's what they get. And in science, we often think, for example, of publication as an end point. It's not. Publication's a birth process. It may be painful, but it's a starting point. It's not over. You as the woman in the case may feel like it's over. Pregnancy is over, but now the world has access to your paper. And now it has, now it owns you. You don't own it. It's what the audience gets. And so my principal is that it's the author's job to make the reader's job easy. And we often, I think, when we try to communicate, we forget who we're trying to communicate to. And so I want to start with a few questions. When we do things in science communication, we do them just out of habit. Do we do them because, well, I've seen someone else do this, so I think this is what I'm supposed to do, even if it's a bad idea? Or do we do it because we've really thought about who I'm targeting and what they need? So I give you a couple of examples about what I think are really bad ideas that are pervasively common. Now this I have blurred to protect the guilty. This was the first page of a research proposal that I was sent to review. And it's like, okay, I don't have to read a single word of that document and I already hate you. That's not a good way to put your reviewer whose proposal's fate, controls, when I have to look at something like that and go, oh my God, that's just a sea of gray. And I have to try to figure out what you're communicating to me. No, I'm not happy and I'm not friendly. And you need me to be your ally. Bad start. Here's another one that's really common. People almost always have an acknowledgement slides at the end of talks. So the thing the audience sees for the longest period of time in most people's talks is the one thing they absolutely don't give a shit about. I don't care who helped you do the work. I want to see your conclusions. I'm still dwelling on your science, not who funded you or who did it. In a paper, we have acknowledgements. It comes after the paper. We don't have to read them. In a talk, there is no after the talk, except once you've left the room. So why do we have an acknowledgement that sits there while we're asking questions and discussing, instead of a conclusion slide to help the reader assimilate your message? And yet I see this all the time. I think it just became a habit. People do it. This is what you do. It's important to say thank you, but this is a bad way to do it. Do it well. Up front, when you're presenting, here's what so-and-so did. There's lots of good ways to do it. Even just flip it up and then go on to the thing people care about. The conclusions, go back to it. Or posters. Name and affiliation withheld to protect the guilty. I once figured out that, like the American Geophysical Unions, there are several miles of posters every day. And the beer's over there. And the friend I haven't seen since last year is over there. And you want me to look at this? No, this is not thinking about what the audience needs. And it's important to do that. I'm not going to read all those words. I might look at that and say, wow, that looks really interesting. So tell me, what's the story? The one thing I won't do when I see something like this is actually read the words. So why did you put them there? Streamline it to focus on what I need as audience. And we think of publication because I need it for my, my academic career. But my success is not based on publishing. It's based on people recognizing the value of what I published. Increasingly, we're pushed more and more and more on numbers and numbers and numbers. But our reputations in our fields are not based on how many papers we publish. They're based on the few best papers that have the greatest impact, that move the field the most. Quality ultimately is more important than quantity, but we increasingly are, funders, governments, whatever, want to see numbers, numbers, numbers. So again, communication isn't what you give, but what they get. So that means we need to think about communication from what an audience needs and how to, hit the bullseye for every individual. And it's also important to remember that I'm not the same audience when I'm looking at different things. So for example, well, this is slightly out of date, but this is what the view out my window used to be until I moved offices. When I'm reading papers, I'm sitting in my office. I'm reading a paper because I actually want to. I'm doing it for me, and so I'm looking out over the Pacific Ocean and have a great view. What's the view out the window when I'm reviewing research proposals? Is it the same with you? No, it's probably that. Chicago. First half of the proposal I read on the flight into O'Hare. When I'm reviewing proposals, for example, I'm doing it for the funding agency because I owe them. I'm not reading your proposal because I want to. I'm not even supposed to remember really what I read because I'm not supposed to use it. I'm just giving advice. And so I'm a very impatient audience in that situation. When I'm reading a paper, I'm reading for my own edification. And so you get high quality space and time. Proposals, I'm grumpy, I'm tired, I got up at 4 in the morning, and you need me to be supportive of you. So you'd better work on that. So what works for an audience when we're communicating? Well, one thing from a book called Made to Stick, they highlight this idea of stickiness. There are some stories that you will forget within minutes of seeing them or reading them. There are other stories that are so sticky they have stayed with human civilization since, Homer, for example. In every culture, we have sort of our foundation myths, the Norse legends. Those stories resonate and they don't go away. They're sticky. They hang on for whatever reasons. We also need to worry about structure. Stories have structures. People expect stuff in particular places. And if you put the wrong stuff in the right place, it's just the wrong stuff. Whatever you put at the end of the paper is your conclusion. Doesn't matter whether that's what you intended. We expect certain types of information in particular locations. So understanding how to work with different structures is key. And then, of course, there is language. English particularly is challenging because English has the greatest vocabulary of any language on earth because we borrowed words from many. But in any language, how you structure words to make ideas clear is important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. And normally, I often would do day-long workshops as opposed to single-hour presentations. So stickiness. The key thing to remember is that writing science is telling stories about nature. Now, I know academics for whom that just makes them slightly queasy, the idea of using the S word, that what we do is tell stories. That sort of seems like fiction or something. But journalists think about story because they think about marketing and communicating and how you communicate. Humans tell stories. It's what we do. And so you need to think about what is the story. I'm not just presenting data. I see lots of papers where somebody, it's like, here's a great data set. It's like, but you want me to interpret your data for you? Well, then why are you publishing? Why are you trying to publish it? The data rarely speak for themselves. We need to speak for them. That's telling a story. And so if we think about the word scientia, science, in Latin, that means knowledge. But knowledge actually is an understanding is the result of a flow of things. We generate data. In the modern world, data is almost always a voltage from some kind of signal. It means nothing to almost anybody. From that, we distill information, concentrations, rates, actual numbers that might mean something to someone. From that, we sort of synthesize knowledge. And from that, we try to distill it out into the larger understanding. How does the world work? That's what we're aiming for. Most of what I see people dumping is somewhere down in this level. And as an example to make this specific, I'll start with this. What is that? People know? Probably one of the most important images in the entire history of science. It's the X-ray diffraction image of DNA. And of course, it means nothing to me. In fact, there are very few people on Earth for whom that image has anything other than it looks sort of like a kind of cool piece of art. And that is, of course, part of why Rosalind Franklin didn't share in the Nobel Prize. She should have, because she generated the raw data, but wasn't a participant in turning that raw data into a cartoon that speaks broadly to the world. Now, there's all sorts of gender issues and all sorts of other crap that goes in that story, of course. But this by itself is just raw data. I mean, does not actually, you can't get value without it, but it is not the value. The value is in the interpretation, the story, and the knowledge. And of course, that is only about halfway along the trajectory, because knowing that DNA is a double helix begs the question of why did we care? And that, of course, was because we wanted to understand Mendelian genetics and inheritance. And once you see that DNA is a double helix, all of those questions suddenly become clear. So the Watson-Crick paper that was very self-involved and smug, they knew they'd done something really cool, and it's true. But it really was aiming to provide this understanding. If you write papers that basically do the equivalent of dumping a photo 51 on you, on the world, expect the same reaction. Someone will take you, oh, I know how to use your data. So the essential thing in writing a good paper is to distill out what is the message that my audience really needs to take away from this. And so we can do that. We can ask what makes a good story. And yeah, there is this idea of stickiness. And the book Made to Stick by Heath and Heath, and it has a piece of duct tape on the cover using sort of a visual image. They sort of distill this out into a simple acronym, really. Starts with simple. Good stories are simple. That's true in science as well. The double helix is a simple concept. Plate tectonics is a simple concept. They all give rise to whole fields of science. It's not like they're simplistic. It's not like just you pay too much in taxes, which sort of begs the question of whether you get value for that or not. But good, solid stories have a simple, hard core. They need to address something unexpected. They need to show novelty. They need to be concrete, specific. You actually need to see what are the actual nuts and bolts. To become credible, credibility grows from concrete. It also grows from citing literature and all these other things. It also needs to be emotional. And this is one that I think scientists also often kind of struggle with. Like, we're supposed to be dispassionate and objective. So what's the emotion part here? So what is the emotion part that really is critical in our stories? Curiosity is one. I read a paper because I'm curious and I want to know the answer, and you're promising you're going to give it to me. And with a proposal, it goes further than that. Because the difference between the proposal that gets funded and the one that gets the letter saying, if we'd only had a little bit more money, we might have funded you, is one reviewer typically who goes to bat for you and says, I'm going to fight for this proposal because I think it's wicked cool. And I know that 100 proposals in the panel, you're going to fund 3 of them, and this I want to be one of them. That means that you have gotten someone passionate enough about your work, someone they may not know, that they're willing to argue with their friends over this one instead of that one. That, again, is sort of a level of emotional involvement with your ideas. And then, of course, story is what you use to kind of package it all up and make it work. And if you look at the acronym that misspells, it says misspell success. They didn't come up with another S, but that's okay. So we can look at this and say, simple and unexpected ideas really hook a reader. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I want to do that. What is the answer? Concrete and credible convince a reader. Emotion, really, particularly the proposal, is what makes a reviewer your advocate. And the idea of story is a way of thinking about how to package material to hold it together. This does provide a framework for thinking about how I build the story in a way other than just here's my data and here's what I did. So let's talk about story structure. So let's look at a short example. This is closely modeled on something real, even if I made this up to protect the guilty. In summary, we show that X7 alters the expression pattern of extracellular proteases in the flesh-eating bacterium Streptococcus pyogenes, which causes necrotizing fasciitis. If the function of X7 could be fully established, it would likely deepen our understanding of this destructive disease. This is kind of an example of what I call the classic more research is needed way of ending a paper. And my question when I see things like this is, why is this the worst possible, the worst conceivable way to end a paper with this classic more research is needed ending? It's because it pulls the rug out from your under conclusions. You're saying, yeah, we did something neat, but we don't know whether it really works, or there's still major questions about what we did. Now, I have seen good papers that launch new questions into space from what they've done, but they at least give you a good landing pad before they do that. This kind of, there are still uncertainties that we need to clarify about my research, is doing a yes, but kind of ending instead of a but yes kind of ending. Your last words are your take-home message, and if those are to pull the string out or the rug out from under your message, that becomes your message. We failed, not we succeeded. And again, it's not about not talking about constraints and imperfections. It's just about talking about them somewhere else. So when we think about story structure, there are 4 key elements in any story. So any story starts with an opening that sets the place, introduces the characters. Frodo and the Shire, Odysseus and Troy, you name it. We have to know what it's about. Then there is a challenge. What do those characters have to do? Frodo has to go to Mount Doom and save the world. We'll come back to science in a minute. Then there's action. We see what the characters do to actually achieve that goal. Then there's a resolution. What did it all mean? If the Lord of the Rings stopped with the ring going into the Mount Doom, it would be a terrible book. We need to see Frodo come back to the Shire so we see how he has changed as a character, which means we need to close the circle from the resolution back to the opening. How did we solve the problem? And so stories fundamentally are circular. A good story always comes back to the beginning at the end. But of course, it's not quite circular, because by coming back to the beginning, you show how that has changed. How much has the world changed? How much has our understanding of the world changed as a result of what we've done? So it's really spiral. So a good science paper for a specialist audience still uses that exact same story structure typically. There's an opening that defines the big problem. What are you going to contribute to solving? And you better come back to that. It's not just here's a big problem, I'm doing something within that context. You're defining the beginning of the circle. Then at the end of the introduction, typically, there is the question or the hypothesis. Biologists are gaga over hypotheses. Other fields of science don't necessarily get quite as obsessive about them. I know one of the more important papers in climate change was, what's the rate constant for the reaction of methane with hydroxyl radical in the atmosphere at realistic temperatures? There's no hypothesis there. We know methane reacts with hydroxyls. We know there's a rate constant. We just didn't know what it was. The question's the important thing. Then there's action. This is most of the paper. What did you do? What are your methods? What were your results? The beginning of the discussion as you're broadening through here. And then the resolution. So how did you answer that question? How does that help then solve the problem? And that means that you need to kind of right size your conclusions in your problem so that you can actually say something. You're never going to solve the whole problem in a single paper. That's not the way science works. But you need to be able to show that by doing this one little thing, we are making a measurable contribution. By measuring the rate constant for hydroxyl radical reacting with methane, yes, that will help us model climate systems better because it's kind of an important reaction. So when does this structure, however, not work? This is the one we typically use for specialist papers where the questions come at the end of the introduction. So, if you've got a lovely patient audience that's got, years or decades sitting in a quiet room to study, that's okay. Not many of us are like that anymore. More of us are living like this these days. And again, when I'm sitting in my office reading your work because I actually want to learn it, I'm this guy. I'm giving time because I want to figure out what you have to offer. When I'm reviewing a proposal, my job is just to say fund, don't fund. And the faster I can make that cut, the happier I am. Like I said, I've seen proposals where I knew before I read the first word that I was likely to recommend rejecting it. And Dak Crosley, that's what they call it, someone said, if you haven't told them in the first 2 pages, you haven't told them. You know, in a proposal, you need to make the sale quickly because I'm doing triage. You know, does this have a chance of surviving? If so, let's work on it. If not, let's let it die quietly. And I probably have 30 proposals to get through in a very short time. So for impatient audiences, that kind of back-weighted structure where you only get the real resolution at the end may not work real well. You still need those same elements, but you need to restructure a little differently. So if you're writing for Nature, Science, PNAS, or for proposals, usually you need to front weight the story. So we can look at this, one of my favorite examples, in part because Sue Grafton writes about Santa Barbara. So it's kind of like home. You know, I met Bobby Callahan on Monday of that week. By Thursday, he was dead. He was convinced someone was trying to kill him. It turned out to be true, but none of us figured out in time to save him. I've never worked for a dead man before, and I hope I won't have to do it again. This report is for him, for whatever it's worth. My name is Kinsey Malone. I'm a licensed private investigator. So in that concept of opening, challenge, action, and resolution, in the first paragraph of an entire novel, what do we already know? We already know the challenge. We know the characters, we know the settings, we've got the opening, and we know the challenge. Who was he and why is he dead? And we know that right away. And so that's a way of hooking you very quickly. It's a much more front-loaded structure. And fiction writers talk about this as the ABDCE structure, in which there's this initial action to hook you very quickly. Think about, James Bond movies. It always starts with the chase scene. Then you back up to figure out what the story is about. So this is inefficient in terms of information flow, but it is efficient in terms of audience hook. Then you develop it, and there's a climax. We don't tend to do those in science papers, but then there is an ending, a resolution where it all ties together. And if you think that this is only what modern writers do for impatient audiences, we could look at this one instead. All the survivors of the war had reached their home by now, and so put the perils of battle in the sea behind them. Odysseus alone was prevented from returning to the home and his wife he yearned for by that peril goddess, the nymph Calypso, who longed for him to marry her and kept him in her vaulted cave. And of course, this is, the oldest piece of literature in Western kind of literary traditions. And Homer was facing the same choice. He was telling stories in bars and trying to get people to put money in the can. So he needed to hook people quickly so they'd sit there and drink and listen. So again, was dealing with this, you're an impatient audience, I need to hook you quickly. Then I'll back up and tell you how the hell he got there. We use those same kind of structures in proposals and in papers for impatient general audiences who need to see things more quickly. So then there's the resolutions. What is the thing? The one thing, if you would only read one thing from this paper, what do you want a reader to take away? When I read papers, I usually skip abstracts. I usually go straight to the last paragraph. What is the take-home message? Because then I'm going to forget the rest. Why should I spend time reading the rest of this paper? Is there stuff in here that I need to know? So typically, this is going to tell us what we learned. Essentially, when you look at a good resolution paragraph, first it synopsizes the key findings. Then it tells you how that answered the question and addressed the challenge. And then it will close the circle to tell you how that helped solve the big problem. Essentially, a good resolution just runs the kind of OCAR structure backwards. And that sort of also helps create the idea of a funnel, which people sometimes talk about. You start broad, you narrow down, and you broaden back out again to close the loop. So here's an example, and I'll ask, why is this the second worst possible way to end a paper? And also, it's incredibly common. I get lots of these that look kind of like this. And again, this one is closely modeled on something I saw for real in a published paper. Just because it's a terrible idea doesn't mean that people don't do it. And this one, a proteomic evaluation of hummingbirds under simulated migratory conditions revealed evidence of several stress-associated processes: protein degradation in wing muscle tissues, depletion of metabolic cofactors, and enhancement of stress response proteins. Now that does a nice job of synopsizing the key findings. But then this ended by saying, these results suggested that changes in the hummingbird proteome may provide new insights into the complex physiology of avian system biology. And the answer is, what were those insights? Do they not exist? Are you lying? Do you not know what they are? So are you just too lazy to have bothered telling me? Or are you suffering from the curse of knowledge and just assume that they're so obvious that you don't need to lay them out? All of those are bad, going from really horrible to not quite so horrible. But this I see really commonly, unfortunately, particularly in papers from China that often end, and this way we see lots of those in SBNB. They end up with a kind of wussy, these results are important. If you tell me they're important, but do not show me why they are important, they're not important. It's what I get, not what you think you're offering, that matters. You need to show it to me. So for example, you might have written, something like this is the last sentence. Well, hummingbirds migrate remarkably long distances over water without feeding or resting. It is physiologically stressful, and the bird's ability to manage this stress may limit the distance they're capable of migrating. This at least says something real and concrete. And the question here that becomes a delicate one that I would hope you would think about is whether you want to put in the there. Because the birds here means hummingbirds. But this is probably a more general finding, that the stress limits migration. And if this just said, and birds' ability to manage the stress, now means you're talking about albatrosses as well as hummingbirds. Now, if you want to generalize the ending that far in your language, you'd better have started the paper talking about just birds in migration, not just hummingbirds. And this is a choice. Anyone who works on bird migration will probably read this paper, so you can probably keep it tight and assume people will broaden it on their own, or you can make that choice and deliberately broaden the message. There's no right answer to that. It's a matter of choice, but the ending and the beginning need to match at the same level. And this is vastly superior to just ending with a wuss. So think about structure, what you put in those key places. This is the most important paragraph of the paper. It's the last one. Again, I will sometimes only read that paragraph, and if it sucks, I won't bother with the rest of the paper. So now let's spend a little time about language, which picks up on that idea of being very careful about word choice. And again, in English, it's tricky because English is an amalgam of Anglo-Saxon, Norman French, and then scholars brought in Latin because they wanted to show off how much they knew, and then occasional other bits and pieces from other places. So English typically has multiple words for every concept, and some of that's kind of the, pig pork kind of distinction, the peasant's word and the noble's word. I'm a soil scientist. That's the French word. The Anglo-Saxon word, of course, is dirt. But if I say I'm a dirt scientist, people will look at me really perplexedly. You study dirt? Dirt's just dirt. That was the Anglo-Saxon word for soil. Also, it comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for excrement, or its four-word synonym. So, and if you want to learn how to, hit the bullseye of a dartboard, you really have two choices of how to do this. One is you can learn how to throw straight. The other is you can learn how to nail enough boards over the dartboard that there's nothing left to hit. Of course, I can't see the dartboard anymore. And when I read a lot of stuff that looks like this. There's so much qualification and crap around the message. I can't quite see the message. Some people go worse. It's like, I can't even see the dartboard. It's like, what are you trying to say? I don't even know what you're aiming at here anymore. So again, let's come back to this idea. What we do is hard. We are fundamentally dealing with new complex thoughts. And that means that even if you're trying to make your audience's job easy, it's not. Right? Reading science is never truly easy. We always need to deal with this. So we have a number of issues. For example, when we deal with new topics, we need to create a new term. And we have two ways of doing this. We can create a whole new term, coin a whole new word that nobody but us knows and everyone else has to learn. And that is one way we end up with jargon. It's like, what? I don't know what that word means. It's some big fancy Latinate thing that means maybe nothing. Or you can borrow a word from English, in which case the problem is other people may have also borrowed that word for slightly different uses. My favorite example of this is the word adaptation. To an evolutionist, that is a strict technical term. It means a multi-generational selective process in which organisms become more fit relative to environmental conditions. A single individual cannot adapt to an evolutionist. I can't adapt to a warmer climate, only by reproducing and having children that are more fit. Evolutionists use the word that way. It's only being in that mechanism. But just this morning, I was having a conversation with someone who were using the word adapting in a way that an evolutionist would be horrified by. But they don't get to own that word because they borrowed it too. You can borrow it to use this another thing because we're carrying the implications of the term, but using them in different ways. Now, I live in the biology department, so I've learned to become very careful about using the word because I know I get jumped on if I use it in any division other than the evolutionist definition of the word. You know, we also run into things like resilience, which is also a complex concept. In some kinds of disturbance, resilience is just how fast you recover from disturbance. But it always involves a disturbance that ends. You can't be resilient in the face of an ongoing climate change because the stress hasn't ended. But again, you don't get to own that. So we struggle with these, and there's no perfect solution. You can borrow words that carry implication, but then they carry baggage. So now I want to spend a little time going over my favorite piece of academic writing on the planet. Not because it's good, quite the opposite. And someday I'm going to run into the person who actually wrote this, and it's not going to be pretty. But if it was one of you, I don't apologize. This was from a flyer for a seminar in my geography department at UCSB, and we have a great geography department. So presumably whoever wrote this was a really good scholar. But let me read this. Access to information is necessary, but not sufficient in our digital era. The challenge is to objectively integrate digital resources based on user-defined objectives for the purpose of discovering information relationships that facilitate interpretations and decision-making. Anybody know what that means? It actually isn't that complex a message. What's complex is the writing, and we can ask whether this is hard because the material is hard or whether the writing is hard. And again, I like this as an example because this is presumably really cool scholarship that is being presented at a departmental seminar by someone who is a good scholar, but I would say is not a good writer. And academics acquire bad writing habits. I'll come back to work through some of these. One thing, we seem to avoid action verbs. We seem to develop an absolute horror of actual verbs that express real action. You know, biologists never talk about animals eating others. You know, they consume them, or a molecular biologist doesn't kill the rats after the experiment. They sacrifice them to give the sense of we're doing it for some higher purpose. We're not just slaughtering for mere sake. And we often hide action. That goes along with avoiding action verbs. We love using nominalizations, which is what happens when you take an actual action verb and turn it into a noun. A nominalization is by itself a nominalization. The process of turning an action verb into a noun is a process. We give it a name, and then we talk about the name. We also like big words like nominalization. And we like Latin derived words because that shows off, God, I know Latin. I don't, but we like showing off our vocabulary, so we don't want to use words like kill, die, and eat. The Anglo-Saxon peasant words, those are peasants' words. But they're very visceral, and they're very communicative, and they're very evocative. So let's come back to this lovely little piece of writing and ask, where is the action? What are the actions occurring within this? There's really no shortage of them. What actions are occurring here? What are things? I'll start. Someone's accessing information. Someone's being challenged. Someone's integrating digital resources. Someone's defining objectives. Someone's discovering information relationships. Someone's interpreting those relationships. Someone's making decisions. There's no shortage of actions. All over the place, stuff is happening. But is there an actor anywhere? No, there's no actor. It just is happening. This is the kind of active passive voice thing that people sometimes discuss, less so than used to. Passive voice allows you to hide the actor. Now, that can be a useful thing to do. The classic being, mistakes were made, as opposed to I screwed up. And sometimes that's appropriate. If you had 100 undergrads who are out in the field collecting samples, and they're not authors on the paper, it's kind of unethical to say we collected samples, because we refers to the authors, not to all the people who help, but who are not having a voice in the paper themselves. Samples were collected, gets the message done. I don't need to say that Jill and John and Sven and Johan and all these other people actually collected samples. Samples were collected. Beautiful, it just happened. So it has a value, but in a case like this, it's hard to see what the action is. So we can also ask them, if we go past this, where are the verbs? It took me years, actually, to figure out all the things in here that are truly, actually, technically verbs. Because some of the words that even are legally verbs don't feel very verby. So if we look at this, access to information is necessary, is a verb. The challenge is, again, a verb, to objectively integrate digital resources. So to integrate, that's an infinitive verb. That's a split infinitive, which some people in English say you should not do. Of course, the reason they say you shouldn't do it in English, because you can't do it in Latin. And Latin, of course, is the highest form of language. And if it's not possible to split an infinitive in language, you shouldn't do it in English. That's absurd. English isn't Latin. There's nothing wrong with, say, to objectively integrate. And then you come down to the purpose of discovering information relationships. Discovering is a gerund, an ing verb that is technically a verb, but feels like a Latin, feels like a noun. And then we've got integrate and facilitate. Any word ending in ate was borrowed directly from Latin. And so those are both Latinate verbs that don't feel very verby, because again, they facilitate, but no one's doing it. So there aren't a lot of verbs, and none of them are good verbs. None of them are verbs that really express real action, which makes the writing hard to see. So if we fix those problems, we take the actions and we stuff them into actual action verbs, we would come up with something that might read like this. Access to information. Also, I've cut out just the crap filler. So if I back up, things like, but not sufficient in a digital era. That was just as true, that you need information, but just having information is enough. That was just as true for, for the Vikings and the ancient Greeks. It's nothing about our digital era. So that's sort of fluff. Things like user-defined objectives. Well, objectives don't have to be defined by the user, but I'd probably assume that, or I might not need to know. So maybe I don't need that at all. So there's some stuff in there that I want to take a little more time. You could just kill and talk about why. So I'd end up with access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships that allow clear interpretation and better decision-making. Do you now begin to understand what this person is trying to say? Yeah, all I've done is fix the language a little. I still would take, if it were mine, I'd take this another couple steps. We could take it one more step, because this still doesn't really have actor. So now let's add an actor at a critical step, and the writing becomes even more punchy. Access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships, allow us to interpret the data more clearly, and to make better decisions. Boom. The issue with this one, and the reason I might not use it, is this issue. Who is us? It may not matter, but that implies a particular group doing it. And if you're not, and that may be unclear, it may be mixed, it may be muddied. Either of these is way better, I think, than the original. This one is certainly punchier, quicker, and more engaging to a reader. And the thing is, we sometimes have this feeling like if writing is too engaging, well, it must not be quite technical or scientific enough. But we like reading good writing, even if we have a hard time writing it ourselves. And to sort of pick up on this idea of challenges of English, which are distinct, I think, from those in some other languages. I think a lot of these issues, particularly the big ones about story structure, are going to be independent of whether you're writing in Swedish or Spanish or Italian or English. Other issues are not because of the quirks of word use. I saw this just the other day. I thought it was very clever. English doesn't borrow from other languages. English follows other languages and dark alleys, knocks them over and goes through their pockets for loose grammar. We've created a language that is particularly challenging in some ways because it is a hodgepodge amalgam language that has borrowed heavily from its different sources. And those words do carry legacy that if English isn't your native language, might be hard to understand how a native speaker would feel about certain words, but they're important and they're useful to think about. And the key thing is really to be being conscious and aware of the decisions we make in terms of language we use, how we structure things, and that our readers like to read engaging writing. It just means more time to think about how to do that. And so communication, again, is not what you give or what you think you give, but what they get. And that means learning to think about your audience. Now, everything I've told you what not to do, I do in my first draft. In her wonderful book, Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott has a chapter where she talks about shitty first drafts. That's how you get to good second drafts and terrific third draft. And that idea that anything that is your first draft, it's just a shitty first draft. And we even just talk about SFDs to make them even more just sort of casual and toss off. For people who struggle with writing, it's often because they're trying to be perfectionistic up front and can't get the perfect sentence down, so they can't get the next sentence down. Remember, it's just an SFD. No one ever needs to read it. Just get your thoughts on paper. You're going to rewrite it anyhow. So keep in mind audience. And this from David Crystal in his book, Making a Point. So the important thing, the really important thing is to be aware of what the options are. And that really means learning to think about language and writing in ways that I know I did not when I was a student. I had no patience for my literature professors when I was in high school or college. I'm sure they'd be laughing, I hope not yet in their graves, when they see that Josh wrote a book on writing. It's like maybe we got too through him after all, but yeah. So the important thing really is to be aware of what those tools are, what your options are, and how to use them carefully. All the things we can use to make writing horrible, we can also use to make writing powerful. Winston Churchill saved the world with his use of language, and the end of the "we will fight them on the beaches" speech ended with two powerful nominalizations. Oh my God, But what he was saying was, until the new world lost power and might steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. The verb was steps forth, because that's what he was asking the United States to do. Step forth, get in the war. We're screwed, so you need to save us. He wasn't actually asking us to rescue or liberate us. He was saying if you step forth, we won't need to be rescued or liberated. But he ended with those powerful nouns, the rescue and the liberation, because he wanted to leave the verb, which doesn't carry the same solemnity and weight. he ended in the way he did. And I'm sure that is exactly why he was kind of thinking that. So keep in mind your audience. Who are you targeting? Are you talking proposal reviewers? Are you talking readers of a specialist journal who usually are just doing filtering really quickly? I mean, I've had papers rejected from Nature so fast, I think they sent the rejection note before we submitted the paper. I've also had a paper rejected from Nature where when we sent back a query saying, well, you know, all the people who've shown these data on how old trees are in the Amazon, because nobody knew because they don't make rings, and Jeff Chambers carbon dated them. We got back a response saying, I don't know what I was thinking. I'm sending it out for review right now. Please don't do anything else with the paper. I'm still in awe that that editor just completely fessed up to having had a brain fart and admitted that, I don't know, I think I made a mistake. It's okay, it happened. But that's a different audience than reviewers for specialist journals. Keep in mind then, what is the story and what is the right story, how to frame it for that audience. Crystal and I once submitted a proposal. We submitted the exact same real proposal to two different agencies, one to the National Science Foundation and one to essentially the California Environmental Protection Agency. The one that went to NSF was, you know, the effects of fog on coastal ecosystems has long intrigued scientists, which works for an NSF audience. It wasn't quite that, but that's close. For a California EPA audience, like, yeah, right, why do I care? The one that went to Cal EPA said, coastal forests are among California's most treasured and threatened natural resources. And that says, this is your problem, guys. An NSF reviewer would say, that may be true, but that's not my problem. So, and I see lots of papers from China being submitted. They often start with in China, blah, blah, blah. And my answer is always, if the first words of your paper are in China, write the paper in Mandarin, because you're only talking to the Chinese. If the problem is about China for China's sake, why do I want to read it? That's just as true if you say in Sweden or in California. What is the problem that is relevant to your target audience? So then think very much about structure and how you frame the information so that it engages the right audience. And then finally, and least important, which if you're not a native English speaker, I think is a useful message, is language and words. In part, because you can hire someone to help with the language, but you can't hire someone to help with the story. That's your job as the scientist, and you have to do it. This one, editors will help, reviewers will help, and there are professional services that will help if you're uncomfortable with grammar and language. So thank you. I have no idea what time it is, but I hope we have some time for questions or other thoughts.
Thank you very much, Josh. And yeah, we can open the floor for questions. I will pass around with the microphone so that the questions can also be registered. Any questions? Don't be shy. Over there. Yes.
So you talked about engaging the reader and the audience. And I think most of the papers I read are always in a passive way written and not in an active. But you would recommend to write it in an active way like we did, and then engaging the person to follow?
The real issue we run into that is really more about first person is the thing that people are very uncomfortable. It's okay to say we did something. That always leads to slightly stronger writing. And so it's always a good thing to do when it's true. But if you say we measured something, and if I'm the lead author on a paper, I can guarantee you that would be a lie, because I mean, I spent 2 days in my own lab in the last 15 years actually doing stuff with my own hands. Typically, we have undergrad assistants, we have graduate students. A case like that in methods, often measurements were done, these measurements were done, samples were collected, that kind of passive voice can be a way of being honest and effective. But if you want to say we hypothesize, that's absolutely what the authors did. So say it instead of it was hypothesized. Well, who the hell hypothesized it? It had to have been you. So use the strongest effective language to make those messages. And usually that means active first person kind of voice. The reason that whole depersonalized stuff came up and sort of evolved into culture was really this idea that, well, science is supposed to be objective and dispassionate. So if I speak in a voice that is objective and dispassionate, it must mean that I am, in fact, objective and dispassionate. And that's rubbish. I can tell, the best president that the United States has ever seen is Donald Trump. Okay, I can say the most utter rubbish in a very dispassionate voice. It doesn't make it true. So use the voice that is most effective at communicating the message that you actually need to get across. And then sort of work with that so that, if every sentence we did this, we did that, it gets kind of tedious. So then you want to mix it up a little bit. Passive voice is a very powerful tool for being able to control word order and idea order when it's not just about the personalization. Active voice sentences are actor, action, outcome. Sometimes we don't want to talk about the actor. Josh taught this class. Sometimes we actually want to tell a story about the class. This class was blah, 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 blah. That is passive voice. But it doesn't feel awkward if you do it well. So the whole act of passive is actually often misconstrued. It's a very powerful tool. Know why you're using it, make good choices, and it'll be fine.
Yep, coming.
It was an excellent talk. I realize your book is about writing, but can you maybe comment also on visual aids like figures and how they help you judge a proposal, for example?
The same basic messages apply. I mean, I focused the book on writing science because I wanted to keep it short, sharp, focused, and something that I could write in no more than it turned out to be about 3 years, and that people would read and buy because it was short. The same messages apply. It's about what information do I think my audience needs, not just what information do I want to present. How do I condense that, sharpen it, and focus it? In proposals, figures are really important for a couple of reasons. One is a picture's worth 1,000 words, and so you can sometimes be much more clear by showing your preliminary data as a graph than talking about it for words. It also just breaks up the physical blocking of text. And so that too is just a useful thing. So the occasional figure can be useful. And just as the double helix cartoon was powerful, the occasional kind of schematic for laying out the conceptual framing of stuff can be very powerful in helping a reader see how things fit together. Especially when sometimes there'll be a flow chart of experimental plan because you have one big hypothesis, but you got 3 separate questions and 3 lines of research, and then the results all weave together. A reader can lose sight of that in a 15-page proposal. A nice diagram to sort of lay out the structure can be very potent. So the same core ideas apply in all aspects of communication. And if I'd wanted to write a book that no one would actually read because it'd be too big, there would have been similar kinds of messaging. And there are some very good books actually that address some of those. One of my favorite, I think it's really good, is called Eloquent Science. It's published by the American Meteorological Society. And the guy who wrote it, I think, just made a terrible choice in going to the AMS because people don't know that this isn't just about meteorology. It's actually an excellent book that talks about communication strategies more broadly and would be just as relevant if you're a wildlife biologist or a physiologist. But the publisher was an imperfect call.
Any more questions? Don't be shy. Maybe I have actually a question.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned enthusiasm and communicating curiosity, but we also don't want to sound too bombastic or too excessive. So how do we find a good balance?
A good question doesn't have to be an oversell, but will engage because then we look and say, yeah, it's a good question. I want to know the answer. That's what hooks me on curiosity. When I see something where it looks like someone is flopping their arms too hard, yeah, I get skeptical of that. And I've seen papers like that where it's like, this is a really nice data set. But, when I saw once where they're doing a wetting experiment, in in what was actually the Atacama Desert, driest place on Earth. And they talked about, well, what would happen if, you know, climate change? Well, the Atacama's in a rain shadow. It's always going to be a desert. It may not be quite as dry as it is now, but it's never going to be a rainforest. So you need to talk about that within that context of, okay, what's reasonable, what's plausible, and it's not just about trying to overhype, because we've all got good bullshit meters. But most of us, I hope, are also asking good questions, and those are usually what hook. And a good measure of self-questioning and of really addressing the limitations actually makes a reader more convinced. And it's not avoiding talking about the warts of our research. If we could do a perfect project, we wouldn't have needed to. We're doing new stuff where things are complicated and we're going to be wrong. Data are going to be mixed up. Methods are going to have limitations or questions. We need to talk about those. But they should be buried in middles of things, not as conclusions or key points. Middles of sentences are the weakest point. Beginnings and endings are power positions. That's true within a sentence, within a paragraph, within a section, within a document. So we use those kinds of locations to hit those key take-home messages, and then we put those other, you know, methodological limitations at the beginning of the discussion or something. I've certainly written papers where, you know, I talked about this experience wildly artificial, but it still allowed us to ask an interesting question. Get that out of the way, then get on with talking about. And by doing a really good and honest, self-critical job of assessing your work, I think it makes it better. And it's certainly better science and probably better salesmanship too. Because if I think you're overhyping, I'm going to tend to discount all of it.
Hey. Well, Joe, oh, one more question. Okay.
Thanks for your talk. You told us that you get, with papers, you like to read first the conclusions paragraph, and that's where the main...
I usually start at the beginning and then skip to the end. Yeah.
But for proposals, what hooks you up in a proposal? Is that the first paragraph?
If you haven't told them in the first 2 pages, you haven't told them. Proposals have to be front-weighted. The National Science, for example, has this broader impact section. They say it's a co-equal review criterion, equal with scientific merit. They lie. Absolutely, they lie. That's utterly not true, because it's at the end. The broader impact stuff is at the end. If I already know I'm going to recommend rejecting a proposal, I don't care that you have a good outreach and education component to it. The science sucks, the proposal sucks. So I start making assessments right away. Is this a problem that's worthwhile? Is this a good question? Because again, if I don't care about the methods if the question's dull. So yes, at the end of an introduction of a proposal, I'm really kind of locking in the high end of my review. It can go down from there. It's like, yeah, these are boring questions, or these may be really good questions, but you're doing a bad job of answering them. But I'm starting to assess very early. Now, I remember reading a proposal. It was for a graduate training program, and the introduction read like it was written by the university's, grants office, and it wasn't a very good grants office. It was full of hype and buzz and fluff, and I was just getting angry and angry and angry. And by the end of the introduction, I was so close to just locking in the recommend, reject. And then I got the stuff that read like it was written by the actual, academics. And it's like, this is a killer project. But that's about as close thing I ever got to hitting that. I don't even need to read what you're going to do. I'm already think this is just fluff. In fact, it wasn't, but they did a bad job up front because it felt overhyped, and I reacted to it that way. But yeah, if you haven't really caught me in the first couple pages, you're not likely to be able to pick up from there. And I don't think I'm alien in that way. I mean, that's really sort of the experience I developed from sitting on lots of review panels where 3 people have read the proposal and you may only have 2 minutes to talk about it. And so what sells the proposal is the cool stuff. What kills it is what you're actually going to do. The ideas are what engage why people would want to fund it. And then you just need to live up to that promise.
All right.
Another one.
Oh, yep. Last question, then we will need to close because of time constraints. But Josh is going to be outside for a few minutes at least.
Yeah.
So if you have more follow-up questions, please stop and ask.
And all the answers are sort of in the book anyhow.
I was just thinking about what you were saying about the crummy first draft, and then was wondering if you have any, yeah, exactly. And then if you, like how you get beyond that, and if you have any extra kind of insights for iterations and how to move on from there as a process.
It comes from learning to identify the imperfections and to be able to sort of flag what's not working. One tool that is absolutely magic is to get a group of 3 or 4 of your friends to sit down and go over stuff. When I first started teaching my writing class, I borrowed this idea of writers groups from my wife, who's a fiction writer. And they always work in little groups and they read each other's stuff. And I tried it because I didn't really know what I was doing. And it was magic. And it is magic every time you get 3 or 4 people working on each other's things. And the level of positive, supportive criticism is always extraordinary. And so getting some outside eyes on things helps. Printing it out and reading it on paper helps. I don't know what it is, but humans, I think, certainly I react differently to screens and paper. Things that look great for me on screen, when I look at them in paper, it's like, ooh. I'll also sometimes read things out loud to myself, usually behind closed doors. Because that process, I mean, you could hear me in some of the things I was reading in the example, stumbling over words because there are too many big words. If you find yourself stumbling over your own writing, you know there's a problem. But it's also that gives you the time to go in and look at, okay, so how have I framed my questions? Am I using words that maybe my target audience doesn't know? Sort of building this kind of checklist of things to look to for yourself, and recognizing that it's an SFD. The other thing for me is the thing that forced me to learn how to write was the simple dictum from the National Science Foundation: the project description may not exceed 15 pages. My first drafts are typically 18 pages, which meant I either had to learn how to squish the text in to fit it in, which would piss off the reviewers, and that isn't a good idea, or to actually just have to go through and distill things down, collapse it down, get rid of words. And that kind of word smushing process forced me to learn to think much more tightly and carefully about how I'm writing things, how I'm saying things, what I don't need to say. And so that was a useful exercise of just going through every paragraph and saying what word can die. Is there a shorter word I can use? Can I collapse some of this expression? And it's slow and tedious, and it can be fun. You know, I sort of turn it into a bit of a video game. There's 3 words hanging on the bottom of that paragraph. If I can kill 3 words, I get a whole line. That's a score. You know, and just look at, if there's 1 word hanging on the bottom of that paragraph, somehow 1 word's gonna die. And then you kill 1 word and it doesn't quite, and yeah, it does kind of feel like a game that way to me, but that ends up giving you enough space so that, you know, you can add a little white space and make the pages better. And it's just learning to go through that process of filtering and filtering and filtering and filtering. Thanks.
A quick follow-up on that. So would you manage a 10-page proposal in that case instead of a 15? Would it work?
Same rule. I expect if I was trying to write a 10-page proposal, my first draft would be 12.
Max.
Oh, I'm sorry. Probably not. Because I think I would figure that if what they wanted was 15 pages of substance, that if I'm only at 10, I'm probably not giving them as much information as they would look for. I can't think of any philosophical reason why that couldn't work. I just think practically reviewers would say, well, you're not, there's stuff you haven't told me. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one. What I would do would be to make the figures bigger and to spread out the formatting a little. And I would think about, am I being too cryptic? Are there places where I'm not telling readers stuff that they would find useful? Yeah.
Let's thank Josh once more. And